This is Cody Keenan, former Chief White House Speechwriter for President Barack Obama, and you're listening to Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Troy Story, a podcast for the Collar City, where we explore the history and people of Troy, New York, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, John Salka. We're taking another look back at President Barack Obama's visit to Hudson Valley Community College in Troy, New York on September 21st, 2009. For today's episode, I thought that we could benefit from someone with a firsthand perspective on working in the Obama White House. And that's why I am so excited to welcome New York Times bestselling author of Grace, President Obama and 10 Days in the Battle for America, and former Chief White House Speechwriter for President Barack Obama, Mr. Cody Keenan.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. What a privilege to have you. And I've already said this to you, but I'm immensely grateful that you were game to do this episode and help us
Sure.
look back on this kind of really special moment in the city of Troy's history.
Of course.
So we're here to discuss the art of presidential speech writing with you, as your credentials obviously are impeccable on this topic. But for listeners who are unfamiliar with you or your story, can you just give us like a quick recap of your journey that led you to work for the White House?
Yeah, sure. I was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. Went to Northwestern University, graduated, and moved to Washington to just look for a job in politics, not having any idea how to go about doing it. And this was, not to date myself too much, but this is pre-LinkedIn, this is pre-social media, right? So you gotta put a lot of shoe leather to work and go meet people. And in long story short, I ended up my first job was an internship in Ted Kennedy's mailroom. You know, the youngest Kennedy brother, it's one of the longest serving senators in American history. And that began my greatest education, working for him for 4 years, slowly climbing the ranks. And what changed my life was one day my boss in his office asked me if I knew how to write a speech, and I lied and said yes, and stayed up all night long trying to concoct a good floor speech for the senator. And I was hooked, watching Senator Kennedy read something I'd written on television, like just kind of, it was like giving Eddie Van Halen his first guitar, like electricity just kind of ran up my neck. And careful what you wish for, because it's all I wanted to do from then on out. So I joined the Obama campaign early in 2007 as the third speechwriter, as an intern, but as the third person on the speechwriting team. And I just never let go. Worked on the campaign, went to the White House, worked as a speechwriter all 8 years, and then President Obama asked me to stay with him for 4 years after that. So that's a very truncated version. Um, but the kind of I teach speechwriting now at Northwestern in the same room where I took political science classes 25 years ago, and I tell my students there's no one way, to kind of I fell into my dream job by mistake. If I had tried to plan it out or drawn up a map to get there, I probably wouldn't have gotten there. But I just kind of, I worked really hard and made sure I was the last one around at night and likable enough that, when opportunities arise, people will think of you. That's it's pretty cliche advice, but if you work hard and you're not a jerk, doors open.
Before we get to the president's address in Troy in 2009, um, I wanted to sort of rewind to 2009 itself for you. What are your memories of that first year of the president's term, big issues, policy debates, and your role in that sort of controlled chaos of a White House administration?
Yeah, and that first year was extra chaotic. I think most people won't need a reminder, but the economy fell apart 6 weeks before the election. I think it was like September 15th that all the big banks started going belly up. And that, to Obama's credit, he never complained about it, but that sort of hamstrings your entire presidency from the start. Like, instead of hitting the ground running with the plans that you ran on, suddenly you got to save the global economy. And for us as speechwriters, that also meant, learning about a bunch of stuff that we probably didn't take the time to learn in college. I mean, I remember early on, it was like, okay, you got to go write a speech about, rescuing the housing market. Okay, can anybody tell me how that's done? So we're meeting with people at Treasury, and the great thing is everybody would take our calls. But so we're sitting down with the Treasury Secretary who's explaining what this policy is going to do, what it's going to mean to people. And I was 28. I'd never owned a home, you know. I'd only had a few jobs at that point. I didn't have kids. So fortunately, being a speechwriter, you have to be able to synthesize um, data and policy information pretty quickly, but you also have to have a pretty significant sense of empathy. Like even if you don't have kids, you can put yourself in the shoes of somebody who does. Even though you've got a job, you can put yourself in the shoes of somebody who just lost theirs. Um, so a lot of that first year was triage for the American economy, for the global economy, the auto industry. Places like Albany, Schenectady, and Troy, who weren't just suffering a brand new recession, but have been suffering one for a couple decades. So how do you, and then this lends itself to the speech you gave there. How do you tie together all these different policies that you're trying to pass and work on into a story that's easier for people to grasp, because it could just we were probably working on about 30 things at once, and it's very easy to lose the narrative thread if you're just watching from afar, being like, what bill is he signing now? What money, what are they spending my tax dollars on today? And so going back to read that speech in Troy, that was for those poor people who showed up. That was a dense policy speech where we were just trying to take together all the, threads of economic policy and tie them and weave them together into a story about, you know, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going.
Your book fully explores and there's a copy behind you, which is that's expert branding there behind you. Perfect location, perfect placement. Your book, Grace, fully explores the relationship between a speechwriter on the subject, in this case, President Barack Obama. And a line from page 4 of your book sets the tone for the remaining 296 pages, which is, quote, to be a speechwriter for Barack Obama is fucking terrifying, unquote.
Yeah. Yeah. We can curse on this show.
We can, and we encourage it. We encourage it. Take us through as we think about, as we talk about and reflect on this 2009 speech in Troy. Can you sort of take us through what the standard process for drafting remarks for delivery by the President of the United States? How does that process begin?
Yeah, all right. It usually begins about a month out, if you're lucky, right? We would kind of craft a long range calendar, message calendar, and then try to get a little bit more granular as you're a month out, and then 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out. So this would have been something we would have known about for about a month, because you have to send advance teams to scout it out. Secret Service has to go. The policy teams want to make sure that everything's up to snuff. Um, and then it would probably take us about a week to write this speech. So we would begin those processes by sitting down with Obama on the front end, and we'd be like, here are the 5 speeches we're here to talk about today, and for each one we basically begin with the same question, which is, what's the story we're trying to tell, right? So with the speech in Troy, the story we're trying to tell is the story of how we got here, the story of everything we're putting into place to try to get out of it, and the story of what the economy is going to look like going forward if we kind of continue to put these plans into action and live up to some of our most timeless values. Sometimes it can be more fun than a policy speech. No offense to anyone who had to endure that policy speech, but if it's like, hey, we've got this fun speech coming up next week. Anything on your mind? Um, then we'll go back and start drafting, and that's a solitary process by design. We always, all of us agreed that it just took longer if it was like two people huddled around a computer. Just let me work alone. And then we would usually share a draft among the other speechwriters. There were 8 of us total. Two worked solely for the First Lady, two worked solely on national security and foreign policy, and the other 4 of us were just sort of utility players who could write anything. And once we were done with that, we would because enough time has passed, we would kind of say, all right, send it around, see what the assholes think, and that's when we'd send it to about 70 people, policy advisors, the comms team, the lawyers, the fact checkers, like everyone who needed to see it before it got to Obama. Um, and then they'd all send us their edits, even whether it was in their wheelhouse or not. And then it was up to us, which edits to take, how to rework it. And then we usually give it to Obama the night before, and he'd stay up until, for significant speech, he'd stay up till 2, 3 in the morning working on it by hand. And we'd come back in around 7 a.m., pick up the edits, put them in, run it by the fact checkers one last time, and then it's game time. Um, and for a truly big speech like the State of the Union or something like that, he'd usually pop in his AirPods and listen to a little Eminem to get fired up.
The address is peppered with these like local shout outs to, people in the crowd, elected officials. How would a speechwriter, for example, in the Obama White House, how do you pull together all the local flair and the history and the names and the pronunciations to sort of like beef up a speech's curb appeal to a local audience?
We worked really hard on that. We did for every single speech. Honestly, a lot of it is just Google and Wikipedia because that'll get you started on what you need to find. We have a team of fact checkers, so nothing ever slipped through. We had one researcher on staff who was also kind of a junior speechwriter, but we could ask her, I'd give her a kind of a template for basically everywhere we went in America. It's like, I want to know everything that's happened, anything interesting that's happening in this town over the past 2 weeks. What's the local story? What are people laughing about? Is there a tragedy we need to be aware of? Does he have to shout out any sad news at the top? How's the high school football team doing? Did they just pull off an upset or anything like that? What is their mascot? Right? Just saying, go Tigers at the top gets an immediate pop. It's cheap, and that's why you do it. Um, and then we'd have an advanced team on the ground, and they would tell us about anything they'd learned. And I'd say, hey, if you meet the mayor, ask him if there's anything Obama should say. So we'd get all these details, and then the trick was sometimes making sure that your opening paragraph wasn't a whole page long because you had so much good stuff in there. But always have a joke, always have a local sports shout out, shout out the local character. My least favorite part was the acknowledgments section where they just shout out it's the worst part of any speech. And the political affairs office or legislative affairs would usually give you a card and say, here, or shoot you an email and say, here are all the people he needs to acknowledge. I'm like, no, you know what? No, this is going to take 2 minutes and CNN's going to cut away. And they're like, well, he has to. I'm like, says who? Like, what happens if they're going to stop supporting this bill if he doesn't say their name? Now, Obama and I always fought about it too, because he thought it was nice and old school. I'm like, God, listen, I'm in somebody's town. I'm gonna give him a shout out, give him a little love. I'm like, so fine, but I'm gonna try to keep this as tight and short as possible. And the one time, I don't think it was this speech, but there was one time that somebody on the ground slipped him an acknowledgments card, and it was just going on too long. And CNN really did cut away from what was going to be a good speech. And I sent like just the most furious email to everybody saying, what is the point of doing this if no one's going to see it? Um, that's just me getting on my high horse. But I never liked that part of the speech. I always tried to bury it further down or make it a little bit more interesting. But nobody really cares. They're excited to see the president. He makes a good joke. They're all cheering, and then you have to be quiet for or applaud politely for 2 minutes while he goes down the list of everyone to dog catcher. Um, I rarely won that battle to get it out completely, but it was always kind of the bane of our existence, especially if we have to uncover, five more pronunciations and then put it in the speech for him and tell him backstage, we're like, listen, this is a Polish name. This one's tough. All right, here it is. And um, it just seems like a waste of time. But as long as everybody's happy.
You mentioned the president making a couple jokes, ad-libbed or otherwise during the speech, which he does. And there's actually a moment where he talks about taking a photo with the then mayor of Troy, who was Harry Tatunjian at the time, who was a graduate of Hudson Valley Community College. And it was that they had taken the green room where they were taking the photos with everybody was actually a room that the mayor at the time when he was a student at Hudson Valley had taken calculus in that room, and the
No
president,
way.
yeah, he kind of riffs and says, "Oh, I told him I didn't take calculus," and the whole room kind of laughs. It's a very funny, like light moment of like hyper local recognition that like centers the speech to the people in the room. And this kind of gets to my first point, like how important is it to have nods to local people or locations, not necessarily like acknowledgments, but dropping in those little snippets of oh, I'm gonna mention the local hot dog place that everybody likes, or I'm gonna stop here, or something like that. Like, how important is that to sort of make a speech connect to a local audience from a president of the United States?
And it's important. It shows a couple things. One, he took the time to get to know something about us. Wow. Don't discount that. It's powerful. It helps people trust you a little bit. We call it the handshake at the top of the speech. You drop a little local wisdom. They're like, oh yeah, okay, he's one of us. He's one of us. He knows that the Tigers won on Friday night. Um, and it's just fun. You kind of loosen people up at the start because it's my least favorite place for him to deliver a speech was the East Room of the White House because you go in there and it's most people in the crowd, it'll be their first time in the White House. They're wearing suits and uncomfortable shoes or dresses, and you don't really know if you're allowed to stand or make noise, right? So it's always like giving a speech in a museum, but if you're out somewhere, um, people are a little more relaxed, especially if you're visiting their town. But it's still, the President of the United States. And all the trappings that come with it, this enormous motorcade that shuts down the city, and Air Force One flying around, and Marine One flying around, and there's this kind of holy shit component to it. Whatever your political persuasion, when the president comes to town, it is a big, big deal. And so if you can put people at ease right off the bat, that's like a superpower.
When I listen back to this to the president's speech in Troy in 2009, I'm reminded of how this era of national politics, it almost feels like an anachronistic in its like tone and civility compared to maybe 2025 or the last couple of years. Um, did when you went back and listened to it or read it, do you have any takeaways that like reflect on your early years in the White House, or is it just like kind of another speech, crafted by this team of 8 speechwriters and X number of fact checkers?
It's not just another speech, John. The one in Troy is probably one of my favorites. Um, they're all special, all 3,477 of them. Um, no, his tone and style never really varied. And it's funny because you think like, yes, obviously our politics are not in a great place right now. Probably, I wouldn't even say the worst they've ever been because we did literally fight a civil war. But I think every generation always bemoans the state of politics and yearns for the good old days. I mean, I remember when I first started in the United States Senate in 2002. People were talking about how rancorous and terrible it was. Well, now that it seems downright genteel when I look back at it. And Ted Kennedy always reminded us that, someone was caned to death on the Senate floor. So there have been tougher times. But yeah, we never regretted um, being generous in our tone and style. Even whenever Obama campaigns against Republicans, he prefers to deploy humor as kind of a cutting way of taking somebody down rather than being like, this guy sucks or she sucks, their policies are terrible, they're evil. Humor is much more effective and a lot more fun to write.
It's been 3 years, actually, this month. I think it came out October of 2022, right? Your book.
hmm
So we're recording this in October of 2025. So it's been 3 years since your book has been out. What's been your response 3 years out? Were you happy with the way that the book was received? And like, how did the opportunity to sort of write your own personal White House biography or memoir of sorts come together?
I was super happy. I think nobody was happier that it was over than as my wife was. Because I wrote most of the book during COVID, and while we also had a brand new baby at home, so we were both home, not going anywhere. And then I got to do kind of one of the first big book tours post COVID. Once publishing houses started doing those again. In October of 22, I was on the road for 16 straight days, while my poor amazing wife Kristen was home with our daughter, also named Grace. Um, but it was really fun. I look back on I'm a writer. I love writing. To me, it's we're always kind of bemoaning now our phones and social media, and everyone's like, I don't have time to think. I can't focus. Well, try writing. Like you see these influencers to be like, I'm going to teach you how to achieve a flow state. Try writing. If when you're really kind of grappling with an argument, or the revising process, I love to just get in there and swim in the words and the language and try to, what if I can make this sentence better? What if I can make this argument better? Suddenly it'll be 3, 4 in the morning and you don't know where the hours went. I mean, that is a flow state. That's how I try to explain it to my students now. Um, it was so much fun to write, and the way it came together. I mean, it's the story sort of told itself, which is what was so great. It takes place just over 10 days in 2015, and 10's a great round number. 9 days in the Battle of America doesn't sound quite as good, but it was 10. It was kind of the 10 of the most consequential days in the White House. You don't know that at the time, of course. It only kind of reveals itself in hindsight. But it began with the the white supremacist massacre in Charleston, and ended 10 days later with Obama's eulogy in Charleston, where he sang Amazing Grace. And in between, you had all these kind of debates over Confederate iconography and who we are as Americans and guns. And the Supreme Court was ruling on marriage equality and Obamacare at the same time. And all these questions about, who we are and who we want to be come to the fore. Like, are we gonna relegate, gay Americans to second class citizenship, or people who work two jobs and can't afford healthcare? Are they just destined to, hang their fortunes on chance? Like, what do we care about and value? And by the end of that week, it felt like, we were kind of we were the right answers were coming up every time you flipped that coin. So I intended it to be, really an important history of those 10 days. I weaved in a little bit of memoir stuff because there were a couple of days where nothing really happened. Um, but also, kind of a hopeful blueprint for people like my students and eventually my kids to remind them that they're really in charge of this democracy, remind them of the ways that change has always been made, no matter how long it takes.
The book is incredibly detailed, and as you said, there were some days that nothing happened, but there were days that a whole lot happened, and many chapters of the book are blow by blow of drafting the speeches and the stress of version one versus version two versus okay, I'm going to get some time and sit down with the president and talk about what he wants to say. What sort of materials or documents or information did you rely on from your time in the White House to kind of help write the book? Because there's a lot in there and you get so detailed, and you're obviously very intelligent. Maybe you have it all up here, but I'm assuming there were some other materials that you had to reference to be able to piece together some of these moments again.
Yep, I was really lucky. I had an unfair advantage. I mean, they told us, our first day in the White House as part of our series of briefings, don't keep a journal, don't keep notes. Anything you do write down in the White House belongs to the National Archives, belongs to the federal government. There is no such thing as a private email or private journal. So they said flat out, anytime you write anything down, it doesn't belong to you. So I didn't bother keeping notes or a journal or anything like that. I never imagined I'd write a book. And then when the story started coming clear in my head, I was like, oh shoot, I got nothing here. I always had every draft of every speech on my computer, which I also had to turn over. But I stayed with Obama for 4 years after the White House to help him with his memoirs and speeches, and that gave me immediate access and direct access to the National Archives. So unlike, if I was on the outside, kind of just filling out forms and waiting for weeks, months, years, I could just email someone at the archives and be like, hey, can I get um, every email I sent or received over these 10 days in 2015? And they were like, yeah, and I got it 3 days later. And I spent a couple weeks just pouring through every email. And I reconstructed a lot of the book that way because there were things that happened that I forgot about. And some of the conversations in my book, people are like, that's really detailed. How do you remember every detail of that conversation? Well, spoiler, because a couple of them were email chains, you know, and it wouldn't be because the White House is not like the West Wing TV show. You're not doing walk and talks all the time. It's too small. Everyone's sitting in their offices emailing each other unless you're in the Roosevelt Room for a meeting. So I took a bunch of email chains and they're word for word still real, but I moved them into a conversation instead with the person's permission because it was a conversation just over email, and it wouldn't be a good book to say something like, John emailed me X and then I replied Y and then he wrote back Z. Like, how boring is that? Instead, I just, made it like we are just sitting down in person. So that's how those conversations in the book are so clear. But it also reminded me a lot of things I forgot. Like Obama did Mark Maron's podcast for the first of two times that week. And he did some pretty consequential stuff on that podcast. And I was like, my God, I forgot that happened that week. So that, kind of helped flesh out a chapter of the book. But it was mostly fun I could throw in a bunch of color and little vignettes that I'd completely forgotten about because we'd been emailing about it all the time.
That's so cool to be able to go back and look at that because you're at a disadvantage to not be able to write anything down because essentially just at the end of the day, I don't know, maybe it goes in a folder or just goes in a file and then somebody takes that box away and it's gone forever. But that's amazing to have that, like you said, competitive advantage to literally just be able to get to the archives
Oh
and
man, I was so lucky, so lucky.
in moments of the book you talk about this, you express these like intense internal fears of failure or believing you would disappoint the president or your fellow White House staffers, as you toiled away in these little micro offices at whatever current speech you were working on. And obviously, at the other end, you generally always came out with a final draft that kind of stands alongside many of the great speeches that the president wrote. But I think a lot of people today can probably like identify with that feeling of sort of like intense anxiety, but just feeling like you're not up to snuff. And that must have just been an incredible like high wire type of act. That feeling to feel like you always have to deliver like every single time on a speech because the words that you're writing are coming out of the mouth of one of the most powerful people, if not the most powerful person on the face of the planet. How did you kind of like cope with that? I know you talk about going out and smoking, having a smoke or whatever, or just stepping away from your computer, but what was that like to be under that kind of intense pressure cooker kind of environment?
Oh, thanks so much for bringing all that back up, John. Uh, it was awesome. I mean, it was it was always an exciting privilege and terrifying and stressful. Because none of us ever felt entitled to be there. We always felt like it was a gift, and it was not the type of thing we wanted to screw up because there are too many people counting on us to get it right. We also knew there were a million people who wanted our jobs if we couldn't cut it, So we always felt the pressure to do right by him because he was one of the best speech makers who's ever sat in that office. And he had been doing it himself before any of us came around. I mean, to this day, he reminds me that he wrote that 2004 speech that made him famous by himself. But so we never wanted to let him down. We always wanted to get him, a first draft that was sort of worthy of his talents or worthy of, choosing and trusting us to write for him. Um, and but part of that was also our fault because he never asked us for perfection. He never said, "I expect every draft to be great." The only thing he ever expected was that it would be something he could work with because he liked playing with it. If he had 48 hours in a day, he'd probably still write all his own stuff. Um, so he always just said, give me something I can work with," which made the job easier too because you knew like he was our safety net in a way, right? If the speech kind of sucked, hopefully the other speech writers would help us put it together first and pick it up first, but he'd get in there, and I go into great detail about the writing of the Charleston eulogy in my book. He tore up the second half of it entirely, every word gone, and that's a tough thing for a speechwriter to see. But what was so cool about him is he rewrote it by hand and then brought me into the residence around midnight the night before he gave that speech on day 9 of my book and walked me through what he did, right? Instead of, I think a lousy boss would be like, you really screwed this up, and I had to spend 3 hours rewriting it myself, right? An even worse boss would say that, and then also, or not even bring you in at all. Just email the chief of staff or whoever and be like, hey, get these edits back to, Cody, tell him it sucked. But he was a good boss. He brings you in, and he sends you away from those experiences feeling better about yourself rather than worse. Like when I left, there was no part of me that um, felt bad about myself for giving him a speech that he tore up half of because what he did made it so much better. And he did remind me, he was like, you gave me something I could work with, and I did work with it. I tore the back half up because I liked an idea you had in the front half, and then I decided to run with that. You'll see your stuff in there. So to make the people who report to you uh, walk away from an interaction like that feeling better about themselves and not worse is a pretty great leadership quality that he had. But yeah, that's why we worked so hard on those speeches. We care about what he's going to think. We care about proving that we deserve to be there, and we actually really do care about the audience. I had a professor once who said, anytime you're writing a speech, imagine that it's the only time this audience will ever hear you speak. So we wanted to make sure we brought our A game everywhere we went, whether it was Troy or anywhere else.
And it's funny as you're kind of walking the listeners and myself through this. It's interesting that like the fundamentals of speech writing, whether it's like discussions with the principal, the person who's going to deliver it, the research, the multiple drafts, they apply to a speaker at any level in any context, any political office, et cetera. And it makes me think of the seven or eight state of the city addresses that we'd write, sort of like the mayoral equivalent of the State of the Union that you deliver every year, obviously with much lower stakes. But the process always started with those direct conversations with the mayor about priorities, about challenges, about like potential solutions to those challenges, and then the meetings, like you said, with the assholes, like having to say, hey, can you review this? Like, tell me if this is right. Tell me if this is wrong. If this is wrong, what should we do? And then those multiple rounds of edits before that, like frantic home stretch of like hitting prints to put in the mayor's hand before he walks up to the podium. So I'm really kind of fascinated and like enjoying the fact that all of these sort of things you're explaining, whether you write for the White House or whether you write for your local council member, is a relevant process. And I hope that people are kind of listening to this now and can take something away from it.
Yeah, same at every level, and so is that stress and anxiety of just trying to get the speech from your laptop to a printer or teleprompter. That final mile, you're just like, oh my God, like something, what could possibly go wrong here? The internet goes down, the printer's out of paper, somebody forgot a binder, whatever. It's always something. So I never exhaled until he hit the stage and the first words were right, then I could relax.
I wanted to get a little bit of local historical flavor to Troy, and having you here, I thought this would be a great opportunity to have someone with contemporary experience working in the White House to look back at these consequential moments in American history specific to the city of Troy. Um, some people may know, but on September 29th and 30th of 1960, which last month would have been 65 years ago, uh, this was just 5 weeks before the 1960 presidential election. Troy hosted not one, but two visits from the Democratic and Republican nominees for the White House, then Senator John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts, and then Vice President Richard Nixon, who was running to succeed his boss, President Dwight Eisenhower. Both candidates made campaign stops in Troy's iconic Monument Square, just 24 hours apart from one another, which is really fascinating. And we were able to track down copies of their respective remarks, which are available through some of the presidential libraries, which I thought was great. And you were game to kind of go through them. So I was really excited to kind of offer this up to you, and you were game to do it. So Senator Kennedy delivered a very short stump speech standing at the corner of First and Broadway. And there's this one iconic photo of the moment JFK, he's standing atop the trunk of a campaign vehicle speaking to a packed crowd of supporters and onlookers. They're boxed in by these two large buses, and it's set against these historic buildings surrounding Monument Square. And the iconic approach staircase is leading up to the RPI campus is sort of visible off in the distance through the fog. It's a really great photo. The transcript of the remarks, it's very short. It reads like a traditional stump speech. But Cody, I'm curious, sort of on your take, if you had any take on JFK's remarks that day.
Yeah, both that one and the other one that we'll talk about were stylistically so different and interesting, and stylistically so different from the way Obama came and spoke that day. I mean, Kennedy's was probably, I didn't count the words, but probably 1/30th the length of, no, not that, maybe 1/20th the length of Obama's, but holy smokes, it was so short. And he really doesn't mince words. He just gets into it. It almost made me think he had like 20 stops to make that day stumping. He gave one local shout out to O'Brien, right? He was like, Kennedy and O'Brien, just keep, a good shout to all the Irish people in town must have lost their minds. And then he just kind of immediately vaults into, and it was weird for him too, because he almost sort of abandons the live audience to just go right into a stump speech about, big things, the state of the world, the Cold War, what America stands for. And it was almost jarring as to like how quickly he goes straight from O'Brien into like, listen, we're engaged in a great struggle. Um, but I also respect it. Like, there wasn't a whole page of handshaking. Yeah, I'm a busy man. I got to win this election. Let's get going. I kind of wish we could do that more often. I had no problem writing short. The biggest violator of keeping things short was Barack Obama himself.
Vice President Nixon's visit involved brief remarks outside the Hendrick Hudson Hotel, which is just steps from where then Senator Kennedy, gave his speech the day prior, before he goes inside to attend a farewell dinner for outgoing Republican Representative Dean Taylor, who represented Troy and Rensselaer County in Congress since 1942. Taylor was a close confidant of Nixon going back to his time when Nixon was a representative for California in Congress. Um, just a little bit of Troy history for our listeners. So, Congressman Taylor was succeeded by Republican Carlton J. King, and he was the former Saratoga County District Attorney who was reelected 6 times. But in 1974, he was defeated by Democrat Edward Ned Pattison during the 1974 election that swept a record number of Democrats into Congress following Nixon's resignation due to the Watergate scandal. Pattison was also involved in Kennedy's 1960 campaign in New York State and was likely there for Kennedy's visit to Troy in the capital region. Pattison served 2 terms in Congress before losing re-election in 1978. Flash forward to 1995, and his son, Mark Pattison, was elected as the mayor of the city of Troy, and he went on to serve 2 terms, leading the Collar City through 2003. So, just kind of an interesting through line from the Kennedy and Nixon visits up through the mid 90s and into early 2000s, how a lot of these characters and these families are kind of all threaded together. And for our listeners, our full interview with Mayor Pattison, I included in the show notes, and that he also discusses his time working on his dad's congressional campaign in 1974. So back to Nixon's speech. This is the reception for outgoing Representative Taylor. Like you said, very different stylistic speech. A lot more freewheeling, a lot more familiar language. It was more casual. It clearly wasn't. He probably had a couple notes in front of him, but it was a very familiar, like he was talking to a hometown crowd or a room of friends. Kind of is how the speech struck me.
Yeah, I'd love to see video of it because how it struck me as, first of all, it's a lot longer than Kennedy's, but it also, what struck me was how many words he used to say very little. Because Nixon was always kind of uncomfortable in his own skin, and I don't know how he was on the campaign trail, but reading this, there's a lot of meta commentary in it. He spends a lot of time talking about Dean Taylor, but he also spends a lot of time like kind of commenting on the room and talking about commenting on what it's like to run for president and saying, there's a lot of you here, so I think there's too many. I won't be able to shake your hands because there's too many of you. But it's like, what are you talking about? There's very little about why he was running for president or what he wanted to do. It was just kind of like this sort of uncomfortable, running for president is hard, and then you have to come do things like this, and like, what like do you like doing this or not? Because if you don't, I'm sure there are other people. But you've got that crowd in front of you. What are you going to tell them? Other than just saying, "Wow, there's a lot of you. I don't think I can shake your hands." He just seemed profoundly uncomfortable in his own skin. Whereas, what I'll be a little critical of Kennedy for is it didn't. And again, I'd love to see video of that. Um, is that he kind of went over the audience's head. Very quickly he talks to you, and then he's out of there talking about the Cold War, and huge stakes from something that was clearly prepared, or at least, prepared in his head in the beginning. But it's like that old canard. People who listened to the Kennedy Nixon debate on the radio thought Nixon won. People who watched it thought Kennedy won. So I'd love to see if there's video. There probably isn't, but if there's video of these two speeches, if they come across differently.
Yeah, it would be interesting, like the written page versus how it's delivered in tone and the audience reaction. It could be interpreted completely differently. Absolutely,
I
absolutely.
imagine, like, if this was Obama giving the Nixon one, I'd be screaming at the television, being like, "What are you doing? What are you doing? You're wasting this audience. You just read what's on the paper, man." You know?
Well, it's true. It's kind of, I mean, the adage, kind of like every word the president of the United States says is consequential. So why say anything other than what you absolutely need to say in the moment? You
Yeah,
know.
totally, totally.
Do you have any favorite speeches delivered by previous presidents or other notable figures in American history? I know that comes up in the book a lot, and you talk about inspiration, but just curious if something a little bit more off the beaten path.
No, it's shocking how cliche it is. My favorite presidential speech of all time is John F. Kennedy's the moonshot speech at Rice University. It's like it's just brilliant. It's big, it's audacious. He uses tons and tons of humor, tons and tons of local color, um, to do something that's so thoroughly missing from our politics today, which is just a big, bold, optimistic, audacious goal. Like, remember, this was 4 or 5 years removed from the Soviets shooting Sputnik up there, right? And like again, imagine what that felt like, to the existential dread of the evil empire having, a satellite over our heads, and we don't have anything up there. Who knows what that thing's doing? Now it's just like a tin can that beeped, but like that's pretty scary that they're so far ahead. So Kennedy goes out and goes, all right, tell you what, we're going to stand up a space program from nothing, and we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him safely home, all in less than 10 years. And you're like, that's crazy. And then we went out, the even crazier thing is we went out and did it in less than 10 years. That's nuts. That's just, and then now, it takes us a decade to build a bridge. I'm not going to bemoan everything, but it's just, that's why I love that speech. It is bold, audacious, optimistic, funny, and then it came true. It's just wonderful, wonderful stuff. And the writing is vivid, colorful, clever. It's just a beautiful speech. And then Bobby Kennedy was kind of my I can't say favorite brother because I got to work for Teddy for so long, but Bobby was the one who had this sense of, you know, moral outrage, that it was just like a hot knife through butter. Like that there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong, and he was just kind of raw like that, and that's what I loved most about him.
The weight of the Oval Office and maybe even your place in the broader trajectory of the White House in American history, working in a place of such significance. Did you ever think about the people that came before you, whether they're speechwriters or special advisors or whatever? Not necessarily your place in White House history, but just where you were now and sort of the people that had come before you.
No, and I don't want. I know that probably sounds like egomaniacal or cocky. It's more in that it was just we were always trying to keep our heads above water as it was. If we had time before, certain speeches, I would look to see how presidents had done it in the past, right? Like I remember, I was on deck to write like Obama's first Memorial Day speech as president, and I was like, okay, oh my God, what are we supposed to say? What do presidents do here? So I went back and like read, most of the recent ones. But otherwise, we wanted Obama to sound like Obama. You don't really want him to sound like anybody else. So we wouldn't flood ourselves with too much stuff. There were times when he would give us direction. When we were still campaigning, we were all in Chicago, and the economy started falling apart. He got us on the horn and said, "I want you guys to go read some FDR and look at it for study it for tone, see what he was telling people, because like this is." He said, "I don't think the political class realizes yet that this is not a blip. This means that we're going to be somewhere near 10% unemployment a year from now, right? So how do we have to start talking to people differently than we are?" Um, when we had a really obstructionist Congress in 2010, he said, "Go, read some Truman about the Do Nothing Congress and try to channel that anger." And obviously he loved reading Lincoln, but that was it really. There weren't a lot of times where we had the time to sit back and kind of think about the ghosts walking through. I remember one time I actually did it. I think it was my first time I was in the Oval for a meeting, like an actual policy meeting with a bunch of people, and I was sitting on the couch and feeling profoundly like I didn't belong there. I'm the 28-year-old kid in there, and there's the Treasury Secretary, there's Rahm Emanuel, there's so and so, and like in my head, I'm like, wow, oh my God, it's Rahm Emanuel, because that's someone who I just knew from the television before I joined the campaign. And then I'd kind of slap myself in the head and be like, oh my God, stop doing this. You have to listen and pay attention because you have to write this speech. So shut up, stop thinking about that stuff. Pay attention to what Gene is saying. You got to, I'm like, oh my God, that's the program for the March on Washington on the wall. No, shut up and listen to Gene. Um, that's really one of the only times it happened because you really do get used to it. It's the office you go to every day. There's always kind of that feeling when you pass through the gates every morning never really goes away, where you stand a bit taller and you feel kind of full of a sense of purpose, but then you get inside and grab a cup of coffee and you're like, oh my God, I have 50 emails just since I left the house, and then you're off to work. um, but it was an amazing place to work. We didn't have the luxury to kind of swim in the historical waters all the time.
The impact of a presidential speech or address, we're talking about the city of Troy, through the president's 8 years in office. Obviously, he had a number of consequential speeches and a number that you had a hand in. as outlined in the book. But has the importance of a presidential speech or address has it diminished in the age of instantaneous communication? I know we went through a very rapid, change in the way we communicate, even during the president's presidency. The president joining Twitter. These kind of like big moments of the White House moving online in a way that they hadn't before. Um, but what is your assessment of the impact of presidential speeches in 2025? Do they still matter, or is there still an opportunity for those moments, those lines that define a presidency of speeches that kind of like echo through the ages?
The answer is yes, and yes, they still matter. And it's getting harder and harder to break through, and people are trying to communicate in different ways. They still matter just as much because it is a way to it basically becomes any word that exits the president's mouth basically becomes like, not literally law, but the direction of the United States, a direction for the government to follow, a kind of an aspiration for people to follow. Any words can move markets and move armies, so you take them seriously. But it also they all reveal a president's priorities. I mean, we certainly spent a lot of time on our speeches. We spent a lot of time with the argument. We spent a lot of time making sure it was, fact-based and supported and relatable to people. And that often sets the news agenda too. On days when you're lucky enough not to have some crazy story happening. Um, it's how you kind of give, your government, the country, it's kind of marching orders. That doesn't mean you expect everybody to follow it, but you're trying to set down a direction. It's really, really important. Getting towards other methods of communications, I've always said that speech writing is um, thinking before you write, and tweeting is just speaking before you think, right? The way, kind of the attention economy has changed everything. Yeah, it means you no longer put a thoughtful tweet out there. The more outrageous your tweet is, the better it performs, and the more news coverage it gets. But all that stuff is ephemeral. You forget tweets pretty quickly. You don't necessarily forget a big moment. Um, and tweets don't drive a policy agenda forward. Tweets don't really change your approval rating. Um, I think there is a question as to whether, if you're gonna sit down with, you have to think about where people get their news from, and that has changed dramatically in just 5 years, let alone 10, 15, 20. I mean, we didn't really have to deal with social media towards the end of the presidency in that sense. But now you got to think about, some podcast might get, like Troy Story, might get 10 times more eyeballs and ears than the nightly news. And that's new, especially when it comes to young people, right? If you want to convince 18 to 24-year-olds to do something, it's no longer a sit down on 60 Minutes. It's some podcaster that I've probably never heard of. So you have to be mindful of that too. So it's a yes and thing. If you're going to give a big speech, you can't just like have your social media team, tweet it out line by line. That doesn't do anything. You gotta have like a behind the scenes video of walking up to stage in the morning, or a few quick words on why you did it. But then as soon as the speech is over, you're going to sit down with somebody who's going to amplify it to, the people who don't watch CNN in the middle of the day, which is pretty much nobody these days. So it's yes and I can't give up on yes because I still teach this to my students every quarter. But in training the next generation of speechwriters, they teach me a lot too about the modern media environment. They're like, great, I would write that speech for the president, and then I would sit down with Bibi Yaya. I just made that up, but I'm sure there's a podcaster with that name.
Just do a couple rapid fire questions, super short answers.
Shoot.
You've written a lot of speeches. You're a New York Times bestseller. Is there another book on the horizon? And have you ever thought about attempting fiction?
Um, there's not another book on the horizon. I have sure, I've thought about it. I would always write another book if I had the right story. I think there are too many bad books out there because they don't have a story to tell, right? Like my book, the story wrote itself. I just went and typed it up. Um, and I was burning to get it out. I don't, I have I keep notes now that I can, and every time I think of a story, um, I'll jot it down. But so never say never.
At the time of this recording, we're almost 10 years post-Obama White House, which is a longer period of time than 8 years. You worked for the president and the American people. Have your reflections on that time working in Washington changed over time?
Oh, sure. I thought this was the quick answer section. Yeah, in a whole bunch of ways. But I'm proud of the way we did it. I'm proud of the way we carried ourselves. We didn't leave with any regrets. I remember someone was telling me, Obama opened up Cuba and reopened our embassy there and went to Havana and did a bunch of meetings and lifted up civil society. And um, someone from the Bush White House told us, damn it, I wish we did that. And I remember hearing that from someone in the Clinton White House too. And so, but we didn't leave being like, damn it, I wish we did one more thing. We kind of uh, we did what we went to do.
Do you see yourself open to becoming part of another presidential administration, or are we all just trying to get through the current one first?
I would do it. So right now I have a 1 year old and a 4 year old. So right now I would not do it. I cherish being home with them too much, and they wake me up too many times at night. But I think once they're both kind of in school for the day and out of diapers, yeah, I probably might.
What books are you reading these days?
Between a 1 and 4 year old, and we just moved cities, states, time zones 2 months ago. Not a ton, but the book that is on my nightstand right now is Twist by Colin McCann. He's one of my favorite fiction writers, and I was fortunate enough to meet him over the years we were in the White House and invite him to St. Patrick's Day stuff, and we got to be friends. But he's a brilliant fiction writer, and I love his work.
Where can people find more about you, find more about the book?
You can find more about me at codykeenan.com, which I haven't updated in a while. I got to do that ever since my book tour ended. But the book should be in your favorite bookstore. And if it's not, tell them to get it. Support your local bookstores.
It's a great book. I'm on my second read now. I didn't quite
Thank
get to
you.
finish it a second time ahead of this interview. Um, but Cody, thank you so much. This was you were very generous with your time. And Cody Keenan, a New York Times bestselling author of Grace, President Obama in 10 Days in the Battle for America, and former Chief White House Speechwriter for President Barack Obama. Thank you so much for doing this.
It was fun. Thanks, John.